So Warhammer 40k games have recently upgraded from mostly shit to a mixed bag over the past few years. But for every Mechanicus or Inquisitor Martyr, there seems to be a Chaos Bane or a Necromunda Underhive Wars. But while that latter example was a particularly bad, buggy, unbalanced mess, fans of that somewhat niche sub-franchise of 40k need not lose all hope, because there is another. And guess what? It's not complete shit. Yeah! Necromunda Hired Gun is a first-person shooter developed by Paris-based developer Stream On Studio and published by Focus Home Interactive. Despite being founded all the way back in 2007, Stream On has only produced 3 games so far: the excellent but flawed E.Y.E. Divine Cybermancy, and the pretty solid but even more flawed Space Hulk Deathwing. So how does this more recent offering stack up against both the studio's other games and also whatever else you could be playing in the seemingly always crowded FPS genre? Well, if you want a quick assessment, I'd say that Necromunda Hired Gun is a solid recommendation for fans of 40k or just decent first-person shooters in general. But upon closer inspection, that assessment becomes a little more complicated. So for those new to 40k, Necromunda is both the name of a planet in the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the title of a spin-off skirmish-based tabletop game first released back in 1995. While there is a deep lore about the planet itself and how it fits into the massive world of 40k, all you really need to know is that this particular corner of the universe is very big, overpopulated, and due to its usefulness when it comes to manufacturing both weapons and soldiers, is basically self-governed by various gangs who answer to an ultimate hierarchy, kind of akin to that seen in the medieval period. Essentially, it's a shithole. The player takes control of a nameless mercenary who, on a routine job on the titular planet, is suddenly drawn into a larger plot when things go south, with old acquaintances and new threats soon making themselves known. While not the most engaging plot, I guess it does the job, but if I'm honest, I thought the story was mid at best and completely unengaging at worst. It's not terrible or anything, but the dialogue is pretty flat and the characters are extremely tropey, with little to elevate the experience as the game goes along. Serviceable, yes, but I wouldn't be surprised if even the most hardcore Necromunda fans weren't skipping the dialogue after the halfway point. Luckily though, the story in a game like this is not most players' key focus, and while I personally like a great story even in my first-person shooters, Hired Gun could be forgiven for missing the mark a little here and clearly placing their focus elsewhere. All of this is not helped by the fact that probably the tropiest character of all is the nameless mercenary themselves. Near the start of the game, you're asked by a terminal to confirm your identity, which is essentially code for pick how you want to look for the rest of the game from this group of presets. Still, look at these options. I mean, you can be Sci-Fi Captain Price, Aloy, that woman from the front cover of Cyberpunk 2077. This dude, whomever you decide to pick, it has little effect on anything besides the voice actor, which, to be honest, is probably a more important detail than it initially appears, as some of these performances are pretty grating. The guy I settled on wasn't too bad. He kind of sounded like a dollar store Sean Pertwee.
Plenty. Keep going. I'm a butler.
But your mileage may vary. Regarding the other characters' performances, I'd probably call the whole thing average overall. Some good, some bad. Also on the VO front, while I'll talk more about this when I cover performance, the sound editing has some major problems here, with characters sounding way too quiet in certain scenes and others being borderline deafening.
Come on over, he's all yours.
Last chance. Talk.
Oh really? You're gonna protect him all by yourself?
I'm sorry I can't hear you! Don't fire the gun while you're talking!
This problem also wasn't just confined to the characters' voices either, and could occur with sound effects and music, particularly in cutscenes. Even messing around with the settings didn't do much to alleviate the problem, so I'd watch out if you're playing with headphones. So seeing as we just touched on it there, let's talk about performance and bugs. This is a very, very mixed bag. As you can probably see from the footage, more often than not, the game runs buttery smooth and feels great, if a little less tight than some of its inspirations. However, over the course of my roughly 8-hour playthrough, I experienced 3 hard crashes to desktop with no explanation, multiple collision issues such as falling through the map or getting stuck on the environment, missing sound and dialogue, weird animation glitches, disappearing enemies,
Surprise, motherfucker!
and also some stuttering whenever I entered new areas. Now, while this sounds like a lot, these issues were mostly minor annoyances, and there were large swaths of the game where I didn't run into any of them at all. I've also seen and spoken to many others who didn't see half of this shit, so maybe I'm just unlucky, but it's worth knowing going in that your mileage may vary. It's also worth noting that I played on PC with max settings at 1080p, which is the footage you're seeing right now, and I have absolutely no idea how this game runs on consoles. So if you're planning on buying it on PlayStation or Xbox, it might be worth doing a little more research first. Having said all of this though, it is worth reiterating that when issues weren't prevalent, the game is very smooth and barely, if ever, dropped any frames. Essentially, it's clear that the developer wanted a fast and fluid experience, and despite needing a little more time in the oven, they basically hit the target. Before we go any further, can we just take some time to talk about how good this game looks, and how well it captures the source material? While animations often look a little janky, and can bug out, which can kill the immersion a little bit, I would say that Hired Gun's biggest strengths by far are its visuals and its atmosphere. Levels are diverse and yet coherent and serve the canon perfectly, and I lost count of how many times I just stopped and looked around an area to take in the sights. It really does feel like you're on the Imperium's most important seed planet. And from the moving train mission to the depths of the underground to the hub settlement and everything in between, the game just looks and feels fantastic. But enough about the story, the visuals and the technical stuff, let's talk about the gameplay and design. Hired Gun is first and foremost an arena shooter, with connective linear progression in between open, enemy-filled spaces. While there is some light platforming and a few hidden paths here and there, the general run of play will be you travel through some linear corridors to get to a big open room. That open room gets filled with enemies, you kill the enemies, rinse and repeat.
Got the gist.
Now, there are a few set pieces here and there which break up this formula, but generally most of the game follows that format. This is a well-known design philosophy at this point, with recent popular examples from other studios clearly inspiring the devs here. The obvious go-to examples in this regard are Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, both of which Necromunda Hired Gun clearly lifts inspiration from, especially with regards to its movement and moment-to-moment gameplay loop. For example, in Hired Gun, the player is able to take down an injured enemy when in close proximity to them in order to replenish a little bit of their own health. They're also tasked with taking on multiple foes and juggling various weapons. Early on, they're given an air dash and a double jump and a grapple hook, all of which can be used to avoid enemy attacks, close the distance between the player and their foe, or move quickly out of danger in order to regroup and replenish some health, or thin the herd from afar. All of this is lifted from the gameplay and design model that Doom 2016 set out, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. Also, to Hired Gun's credit, this is not where its inspiration starts and ends. For example, the player can wall run and has increased mobility, just like in Titanfall 2. There's a gear system with secret loot chests to find, upgrades to purchase and charms to equip. The player can level up, which increases their stats and allows for them to take on more side quests, to earn more money, to buy more upgrades and loot. The list goes on and on. On top of all of this, Hired Gun also has a few of its own tricks, like the player's pet dog Mastiff, which can be called on a cooldown to attack and occupy enemies for short periods of time. Hey Mastiff, what you doing? Mastiff, what you doing? Don't... Mastiff, no! The problem here is that most, if not all of these systems, have not quite been implemented with as much skill or finesse as seen in their inspirations. In Doom 2016, every enemy had an optimum weapon and approach, and the use of a glory kill was part of a kind of dance the player would do with the enemies. While this is a well-known fact now, the designers even liken their methodology to chess, where each piece would have strengths and weaknesses, and the player would have to use a combination of forethought and reaction-based gameplay to outmaneuver their opponents. This notion was even more prevalent in Doom Eternal, where the devs arguably took it too far for some, with certain enemies only being killable in an efficient manner with a particular weapon or methodology. I don't want to get into the weeds about this, but the fact that the Marauders were immune to the BFG is utter bullshit. Now, let's look at Hired Gun. Firstly, the game doesn't have the same enemy variety, with most enemies being humanoid or dogs and a few heavier units here and there. Secondly, the AI is pretty poor, even on higher difficulties, meaning they often don't feel like they need to be outwitted or bested through that back and forth dance-like gameplay that we talked about a second ago.
What the hell are you doing?
Thirdly, while there are a good variety of weapons, there's no particular matchup game at all, with all weapons being more than capable of taking out any and all enemies. Essentially, the difficulty in Hired Gun instead comes from the enemy's health and shield amounts, as well as how much damage they can dish out, instead of in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, where certain weapons or sub-weapons could give you a real advantage. All of this together means that it might look like Doom 2016, but it plays like an admittedly fun, but altogether weak imitation. Unfortunately, this deconstruction is possible for almost all areas of the design and gameplay here too, with the wall running and air mobility lacking the tightness and precision of games like Titanfall, and the mantling and environments also often fighting with the player at the most inopportune moment. Also on this score, there is no enemy that really requires such acrobatic movement to defeat, and beyond the odd sideways dash here and there, I often found myself playing Hired Gun much more like an old-style arena shooter than a modern FPS with tons of fancy movement and grapple mechanics. There just wasn't cause to use them. Finally, regarding the leveling and loot systems, these are also unfortunately very undercooked. While I do love the weapon variety, with pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, LMGs, plasma guns, sniper rifles and more all being available, it really is a blast to take out hordes of enemies with many of the weapons seen in the tabletop game. Also, most of them sound and feel great to use too, and it's real satisfying to blast a guy in half from close range with a shotgun, or unload an LMG into a wave of baddies. The problem is that any upgrades or newer versions of these weapons feel superfluous when tackling the main story missions, and kind of undercooked and badly balanced for the side missions. Essentially, it all just feels like a lot of this stuff was put in because they wanted to jump on the loot trend or something, but in the end, it's just very undercooked and not needed. I mean, I didn't even notice my character had a level until about 5 hours into the game. All of this also causes some weird balancing issues with the difficulty, and I found that I was often able to beat the main story missions with ease, but even the lowest difficulty side missions would kick my ass. But let's talk about how all this stuff works. Between missions, the player is returned to a hub settlement called Martyr's End, which acts as an area where you can upgrade your gear and weapons, learn new abilities, buy new stuff, talk to NPCs, upgrade your skills, or the skills and stats of your dog, try out some of your new stuff in the training area, or take on missions and side quests. As a side note here, the game also does this weird distracting depth of field effect whenever you talk to anyone in this area, and it kinda does my head in. I'm just saying. Credits are essentially how all of this is fueled, and they're gained from completing side missions, selling gear and other items you might find or are rewarded, or you can just pick them up sometimes when you're out and about. Also, levels contain hidden chests that contain new gear and money, and missions can be replayed in order to find all of these once the game is completed, should you wish to dive in for a second playthrough. There are also multiple difficulty settings which should help add more flavour to a second or third journey through the campaign. As I mentioned earlier, a single playthrough will probably run you about 8 hours, with a completionist run being closer to maybe 15 at a push. While this might seem too short for some, I think it's about right for the kind of experience Hired Gun offers, and it's one of those great reminders that not every game has to be 150 hours long to be worth playing, I guess. During those 8 to 15 hours, the main campaign offers a decent variety of stunning locations and a mediocre variety of mission objectives, if I'm honest. Most missions involve following the waypoint marker or some of the handy glowing green beacons that are always guiding your way, regardless of where you are or what's happened to you. Like, these are part of the narrative, they're not just overlay. Who's placing these? Anyway, after following them for a while, as mentioned earlier, you'll normally run into a large area which will spawn enemies for a while.
Got the gist.
Sometimes there might be another objective, like protect these NPCs or press this switch, but nothing groundbreaking, and certainly not anything that any shooter fan won't have already done a million times before. The annoying thing about this though, is that the game often comes close to inserting some new ideas, but then just seems to back out of them. Like, there's a section in an early mission where you have to travel along the roof of a moving train and dodge oncoming signal lights. Now, while this idea has been done before, it was really well executed here, and I thought it might be leading to something more interesting. But no, you drop back into the train and normal business resumes. Another example comes at about the halfway point of the game, where you're taken prisoner and have all your guns taken away. Now, while the stealth in this game is basically non-existent, and any attempt to implement a stealth level might have been terrible, I again thought maybe something interesting, or at least a bit different, was about to happen. But again, no. After the cutscene, which establishes your capture and removal of your weapons, you walk about 10 paces through a large area which contains no enemies, and then you just find all your weapons again, sitting on a shelf unguarded. You pick them up and carry on. Like, why did they even take them off you for 20 seconds? What was the point? And then there's the boss fights. Oh man, the boss fights. So, while there is a little variety with a few of them, these are probably my least favourite part of Hired Gun. Essentially, what most of them boil down to is a large, bullet-spongy boss rushing you constantly, or firing projectiles at you, or both, and constantly spawning in trash mobs. Now, this is not the first game to run into this problem. Essentially, when you design your shooter so the main way of getting health requires enemies, boss fights can present a problem, unless you provide those enemies for the players to use to replenish their health. This can be seen in Remnant from the Ashes, or the aforementioned Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. Now, while Hired Gun does have a few other mechanics that could help alleviate this, like a revive item that you can only hold 3 of, which will revive you if your health drops to 0, or even medipacks that for some reason are the hardest items to find in the game, it doesn't really use any of these, and instead just keeps throwing them trash mobs at you. Add to this Add to this the maddening VO lines that loop over and over while you're trying to kill some of these arseholes, and yeah, you're in for a pretty bad time.
Die, you throw-down skinny! 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 Die, you throw-down skinny!
Now, it sounds like I've been pretty down on Necromunda Hired Gun, but weirdly, despite all of the criticism that I've levelled at it, somehow I'd still recommend it to the right player or for the right price. All of these weird, janky, sometimes disparate systems come together to form a charming and fun FPS that is much better than the sum of its parts should be. It sort of took me back to the early 2000s era of not just FPS games, but of all games, where you'd happily play a game that was sort of a worse version of one of your favourites and sort of an attempt at a new take because it had enough charm and ambition for you to forgive its shortcomings. I've played a bunch of first-person shooters that clearly cost 50 times what this game did, and many of them felt soulless and cynical, continuing to create the same exact experience annually, or releasing something unfinished to a rabid fanbase and promising to fix it later after the money had already been counted. Maybe this is just my personal perspective, and I've said it many times, but I'd rather play a game made by a passionate set of developers that are trying to do something ambitious, even if they don't completely hit the mark. Shooting for the moon and landing amongst the stars will always be my preference over another Battlefield 2042, or Call of Duty I don't know what they're called now. When you break this game down to its disparate components, they're almost all flawed, and some are downright bad, but put them together and somehow you get a solid experience. I guess the same could kind of be said, but to a lesser extent, for another solid 40k game, Space Marine, which somehow is one of the best games to hold the license, despite the fact that it should be repetitive and underwhelming on paper. But I love Space Marine, and while I wouldn't say I like Hired Gun as much, it's still a great time. Now, don't get me wrong, having said all of this, there are many better shooters you could buy instead of Necromunda Hired Gun, and as I've hopefully fairly illustrated over the course of this video, it's a bit of a mixed bag in a lot of ways. But if you're a 40k or a Necromunda fan, or you just want a solid 8-hour FPS that provides a fun time, some ambitious ideas, and some incredible visuals and atmosphere, then Hired Gun is definitely worth checking out. Despite a bit of an uptick in quality recently, and some exciting projects on the horizon, we still haven't reached the point where we can say we get consistently good 40k games, and so it's important that those that do come along and offer something are called out. If nothing else, maybe stick Necromunda Hired Gun on your wishlist and wait for a sale. You might be pleasantly surprised.